The courtroom was already buzzing long before the hearing was scheduled to begin. Rows of wooden benches were filled with reporters, lawyers, and curious spectators who had heard rumors about the unusual case being discussed that day. Quiet whispers floated through the air as people leaned toward each other, speculating about what might happen. At the center of the room sat Steven Seagal, dressed in a dark suit, his posture calm and composed. His long hair was tied neatly behind his head, and his expression was serious but relaxed. To most people in the courtroom, Seagal was instantly recognizable. For decades, he had been known around the world not only as a famous action star but also as a highly trained martial artist. His movies had shown him defeating enemies with effortless precision, and many fans admired his discipline and calm demeanor. But today, he wasn't here as a celebrity. He had been called to the court to give insight into a self-defense case that had sparked public debate. Lawyers believed his knowledge of martial arts and real-world combat techniques could help explain whether the accused person had acted within the limits of self-defense. Seagal sat quietly at the witness table, reviewing a few notes while occasionally glancing around the room. Across the courtroom, however, one person seemed particularly focused on him. A uniformed police officer stood near the aisle, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her eyes remained locked on Seagal with a mixture of suspicion and irritation. Unlike the rest of the room, she didn't look impressed. To her, he didn't seem like a respected expert or a helpful witness. Instead, she appeared to see him as just another celebrity trying to influence a legal case. Several reporters noticed the tension and quietly adjusted their cameras, sensing that something unusual might unfold. The judge had not yet entered the courtroom, and the room was still in that strange moment of waiting where conversations fade and everyone simply observes. Suddenly, the officer took a few firm steps forward. Her boots echoed sharply against the courtroom floor. The quiet chatter instantly faded. People began turning their heads. The officer stopped just a few feet from Seagal and spoke in a voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "So you're the famous martial arts expert everyone keeps talking about?" Seagal slowly looked up. His expression remained calm. "I'm just here to answer the court's questions," he replied respectfully. But the officer's face hardened. "You actors think you're above everyone else," she said coldly. A nervous murmur spread through the spectators. Something about the situation suddenly felt wrong. And as the tension in the courtroom began to rise, no one could have imagined what was about to happen next. The air inside the courtroom grew noticeably heavier after the officer spoke. People who had been quietly chatting moments earlier now sat completely still, watching the exchange unfold. The tension was subtle at first, but it was spreading quickly through the room. Seated at the witness table, Steven Seagal remained calm. His posture didn't change, and his expression stayed neutral as he looked up at the officer standing just a few feet away. "I'm not here for attention," Seagal replied in a steady voice. "I'm here because the court requested my perspective." The officer let out a short laugh, the kind that carried more sarcasm than humor. "Your perspective," she said, raising an eyebrow. "You're a movie star. This is a courtroom, not a film set." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some reporters exchanged glances, sensing that the situation was quickly becoming more serious than anyone expected. Seagal folded his hands on the table calmly. "I respect the law," he said. "That's exactly why I'm here." But the officer didn't seem satisfied. Instead of stepping back, she moved even closer. Her boots made sharp sounds against the polished courtroom floor as she stopped beside the table. "You celebrities always think you can walk into serious situations and act like experts," she continued. "Real law enforcement deals with reality, not choreography." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Several spectators leaned toward each other, whispering under their breath. One young man in the back row slowly lifted his phone, pretending to check a message while actually recording the exchange. Others noticed and began doing the same. The tension was no longer subtle. It was obvious. Still, Seagal kept his composure. "Officer," he said calmly, "I'm not trying to challenge anyone here. I'm simply offering knowledge that may help the court understand self-defense." His tone remained respectful, but his words seemed to irritate her even more. The officer crossed her arms tightly. "You think reading martial arts books makes you an authority?" she said sharply. Seagal looked at her quietly for a moment before answering. Training and experience, he said calmly. That's what teaches discipline. The word discipline seemed to echo slightly in the silent courtroom. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the officer took another step closer. Now she was standing directly beside him. Too close. A reporter in the second row slowly leaned forward, sensing that the situation might escalate. Another spectator whispered, "This isn't going to end well." Seagal noticed the growing attention around them. Cameras were now subtly pointed in their direction, and nearly everyone in the courtroom was watching. Still, his voice stayed calm. "Officer," he said quietly, "there's no need for hostility." But the officer's expression hardened. "Oh, I think there is," she replied coldly. The room fell silent again. Even the faint sounds from the hallway outside seemed to disappear. Everyone could feel that something was about to happen. The officer's jaw tightened as she stared down at him. "You actors always talk about discipline," she said. "But when things get real, you hide behind lawyers and cameras." Seagal didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he simply looked at her and said, "Respect goes both ways." Those 4 words seemed to change the energy in the room instantly. The officer's eyes narrowed. Several spectators held their breath. It was clear that the confrontation had crossed a line. And as the tension climbed higher with every passing second, the entire courtroom seemed frozen in anticipation. Because no one expected what the officer was about to do next. Before we continue the story, tell me something in the comments. Which country and city are you watching this video from? It's always amazing to see how many different places people are tuning in from. For several long seconds, the courtroom remained completely silent. The tension between the officer and Steven Seagal had reached a point where everyone could feel it. People in the audience shifted slightly in their seats, unsure whether they were about to witness a simple argument or something far worse. Seagal remained seated at the witness table, calm and composed. His hands rested loosely on the surface of the desk, and his breathing appeared steady. Across from him, the officer's expression was rigid. Her eyes were fixed on him with a mixture of anger and disbelief, as if she simply could not accept the calm confidence he carried. "You really think those few words make you sound wise?" she said sharply. Seagal didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched her quietly for a moment before answering. "No," he said calmly. "They're just the truth." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the courtroom. Several spectators leaned forward. Some reporters adjusted their notebooks, while others kept their phones pointed carefully toward the scene. The officer clearly noticed the attention. But instead of calming down, it seemed to make her even more irritated. Her jaw tightened. "You actors always think you're untouchable," she said. "People clap for you in movies, and suddenly you believe you're some kind of real-life hero." Seagal tilted his head slightly. "I've never claimed to be a hero," he replied quietly. "Really?" she shot back. "Because that's exactly how everyone here is looking at you." Her voice echoed through the room. The spectators exchanged uneasy glances. A few people looked toward the courtroom doors, as if hoping someone would step in and defuse the situation. But no one moved. The officer stepped closer again. Now she was standing directly beside Seagal's chair. The distance between them was barely a step. "You think martial arts makes you special," she continued. Seagal looked up at her calmly. "Martial arts teaches control," he said. The officer scoffed. "Control?" she repeated with a sarcastic laugh. "Yes," Seagal answered. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. Then suddenly, the officer leaned closer. "So tell me something," she said. "What happens when someone challenges that control?" Seagal's expression didn't change. "Then discipline becomes important," he said quietly. A few people in the audience nodded slightly. Others simply watched with growing concern. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You know what I think," she said. Seagal didn't answer. "I think all this talk about discipline is just an act." The tension in the room rose even higher. One reporter slowly lifted his camera, trying to capture the moment without drawing attention. Another spectator whispered, "This is getting out of hand." The officer's hand moved slightly as she spoke again. "You're sitting there pretending to be calm," she said, "but deep down you're just another arrogant celebrity." Seagal remained seated. His posture didn't shift. "I'm simply waiting for the hearing to begin," he replied. But that answer seemed to push the officer over the edge. Her face flushed with anger. "Oh, I've had enough of this," she snapped. Before anyone could react, her hand suddenly swung forward. The sharp sound of a slap echoed through the courtroom. Gasps erupted instantly. A woman in the second row covered her mouth in shock. Someone dropped a phone, the clatter breaking the stunned silence that followed. For a split second, everything seemed frozen. Seagal's head had turned slightly from the impact. But what happened next surprised everyone. He didn't jump up. He didn't shout. He didn't react with anger. Instead, he slowly turned his face back toward the officer. His expression remained calm. Almost unbelievably calm. The officer folded her arms again, clearly expecting a dramatic reaction. "Well," she said coldly. The room held its breath. Every eye was now fixed on Seagal. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew his reputation as a martial artist. But no one knew what he would do next. The officer smirked slightly. "What's wrong?" she said. "Not so tough without movie cameras." A low murmur moved through the courtroom. Some spectators looked nervous. Others looked curious. Seagal slowly rose from his chair. The movement was controlled and deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't show anger. But the atmosphere in the courtroom changed instantly. Even the officer seemed to notice. For the first time, her confident expression wavered slightly. Seagal stood quietly, adjusting his jacket as he faced her. "You shouldn't have done that," he said calmly. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent courtroom. The officer crossed her arms again. "Oh, really?" she said sarcastically. "What are you going to do about it?" Seagal looked at her steadily. "I'm not here to fight anyone," he replied. But the officer took a sudden step forward. And in doing so, she made the second mistake that no one in the courtroom would ever forget. If you were in that courtroom and saw this happen, what would you do? Would you stay calm like Seagal, or would you react immediately? Comment below. I want to hear your opinion. The entire courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. After the slap, the tension had reached a level no one expected when they walked into the building that morning. People in the audience sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether to speak, move, or even whisper. At the center of the room stood Steven Seagal, facing the officer who had just struck him. Most people expected anger. Some expected shouting. Others thought security would rush in and separate them immediately. But Seagal's reaction was something no one had predicted. Instead of responding with aggression, he slowly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket and straightened his posture. His movements were calm, almost methodical, as if he were trying to slow the entire moment down. His face showed no rage, no panic, just control. The officer, however, seemed to interpret his calmness as weakness. She let out a short laugh, clearly believing she had embarrassed him in front of the entire courtroom. "Look at that," she said loudly, turning slightly toward the spectators. "The big martial arts expert doesn't even know what to do." Several people shifted uncomfortably. A man in the back row whispered to the person next to him, "She has no idea who she's dealing with." But the officer continued. "You spend years pretending to fight in movies," she said mockingly, "and the moment something real happens, you just stand there." Seagal listened quietly. His eyes remained steady, watching her carefully, almost as if he were studying her movements rather than reacting emotionally. "Violence is always the last option," he said calmly. His voice was low but clear enough for everyone to hear. The officer rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she replied. "Save the lecture." Around the courtroom, several spectators began exchanging nervous looks again. The situation had already crossed multiple lines, and many people were beginning to worry that things could escalate further. Near the aisle, a reporter adjusted the focus on his phone camera. Another person quietly whispered, "Security should be here by now." But the officer wasn't finished. She stepped even closer to Seagal. Now they were standing almost face to face. "You know what your problem is," she said. Seagal didn't respond. You think your reputation scares people, she continued. But this isn't Hollywood. The room remained silent. Seagal slowly shook his head. No, he said calmly. It's not. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the officer made another aggressive movement. She reached out suddenly and grabbed Seagal's arm. Gasps spread instantly across the courtroom. The action was abrupt and unnecessary, and several spectators visibly leaned forward in alarm. But Seagal didn't pull away violently. Instead, he simply looked down at her hand, gripping his sleeve. Let go, he said quietly. The officer tightened her grip. What if I don't? She challenged. Another wave of whispers moved through the audience. Some people looked toward the doors again, hoping someone would intervene before the situation spiraled out of control. But in that moment, it was clear that the confrontation had already crossed into dangerous territory. Seagal slowly lifted his eyes back toward the officer. His expression was still calm. But now there was something different behind it. Focus. Years of martial arts training had taught him something very few people understood, that real strength wasn't about aggression. It was about timing, balance, and control. The officer seemed completely unaware of this. She took another step closer, invading his personal space even more. You know something, she said. Maybe you're not as tough as people think. Seagal didn't raise his voice. I never said I was, he replied. The officer smirked. But you're about to find out what real pressure feels like. Her grip on his arm tightened again. And in that exact moment, something shifted. Seagal moved. Not aggressively. Not violently. Just a small, precise adjustment of his body. But the speed of the movement was so sudden that most people didn't even register what had happened. To the spectators, it looked almost effortless. One moment the officer was standing firmly in front of him. The next moment, her balance was completely gone. A loud gasp filled the courtroom. Because within a single second, the entire situation had turned upside down. And the officer was no longer in control. For a split second, no one in the courtroom fully understood what had just happened. One moment the officer had been gripping the arm of Steven Seagal, standing confidently in front of him. The next moment, her balance suddenly shifted. It happened so quickly that several spectators blinked in confusion, trying to process what their eyes had just seen. Seagal hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply moved. But the movement had been incredibly precise. Years of martial arts training had taught him how to respond in situations where someone else initiated physical contact. Instead of meeting aggression with more aggression, his instinct was to redirect the force. And that was exactly what he had done. As the officer tightened her grip on his sleeve, Seagal had calmly rotated his wrist and stepped slightly to the side. The movement was subtle, but it changed the entire dynamic of the moment. The officer's momentum carried forward. Her balance shifted off-center. Before she could recover, Seagal guided her arm downward while stepping behind her shoulder. It wasn't violent. It wasn't flashy. But it was effective. Within a single fluid motion, the officer lost her footing completely. Gasps filled the courtroom as she stumbled. Her attempt to regain balance failed. And then, she hit the floor. The sound echoed loudly against the wooden panels of the courtroom. Several spectators jumped to their feet in shock. A reporter near the aisle nearly dropped his phone while trying to keep recording. For a moment, the entire room seemed frozen. The officer lay motionless on the floor, stunned by the sudden fall. No one had expected the situation to escalate like this. But what surprised everyone even more was Seagal's reaction afterward. Instead of standing over her or celebrating what had just happened, he immediately stepped back. His hands rose slightly in a non-threatening gesture. I told her to let go, he said calmly. His voice carried across the silent courtroom. The words were simple, but the message behind them was clear. He had not started the confrontation. He had only responded when the situation became physical. Several people in the audience began whispering rapidly. I saw it, one man said. She grabbed him first. Another spectator nodded. He barely touched her. Near the back of the courtroom, a woman who had been recording the entire exchange slowly lowered her phone, still trying to process what had happened. A few seconds earlier, the officer had seemed completely in control of the situation. Now everything had changed. Seagal remained exactly where he was standing. Calm, still, disciplined. He didn't approach the officer again. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he simply waited. Moments later, the officer began to stir slightly. The fall had clearly stunned her. Courtroom staff rushed forward cautiously, unsure of what they would find. "Everyone stay back," one security guard said firmly. Several spectators stepped away from the aisle. Reporters continued recording quietly. This was already turning into a moment that people knew would spread far beyond the courtroom walls. One of the guards looked toward Seagal. "Sir, please remain where you are," he said. Seagal nodded calmly. "I have no intention of going anywhere," he replied. His tone was respectful, cooperative. Exactly the opposite of what some people might have expected after such a dramatic moment. The officer was slowly being helped into a sitting position by another guard. She looked disoriented, still trying to understand how she had ended up on the floor. Her earlier confidence had completely disappeared. Across the room, the spectators were still whispering in disbelief. A man in the front row shook his head. "That was incredible," he muttered quietly. Another spectator replied, "He didn't even attack her. He just redirected her." The reporters knew something important had just happened. Not because someone had been knocked down, but because of how controlled the response had been. Seagal could have reacted very differently. He could have lost his temper. He could have escalated the situation. But he hadn't. Instead, he had demonstrated exactly what he had been talking about earlier. Discipline, control, and restraint. The room remained tense as security continued to assess the situation. But one thing was already clear. The balance of power in the courtroom had completely shifted. And within minutes, people would begin realizing exactly who had witnessed the entire event. Because this moment was about to spread far beyond the courtroom. The courtroom was still buzzing with shock after the sudden turn of events. Moments earlier, the confrontation had been filled with tension and raised voices. But now, the atmosphere had shifted into something very different. Confusion, disbelief, and a growing realization that the entire incident had been witnessed by dozens of people. Near the center of the room stood Steven Seagal, calm and composed as ever. He had stepped back after the officer fell, keeping his distance and raising his hands slightly to show he had no intention of escalating the situation further. Several courthouse security officers rushed toward the scene. "Everyone step back," one of them ordered firmly. Spectators shuffled away from the aisle, creating space as the guards checked on the officer who was now sitting up with assistants. She looked stunned, both physically and emotionally. Just minutes ago she had been in complete control of the confrontation. Now she was the center of attention for an entirely different reason. One guard turned toward Seagal. "Sir, please remain where you are while we sort this out." Seagal nodded calmly. "Of course," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." His voice remained steady, respectful, and cooperative. Meanwhile, several people in the courtroom began speaking all at once. "She slapped him first. I recorded the whole thing. He told her to let go." The guards exchanged glances. Clearly, there were many witnesses to what had happened. One reporter stepped forward carefully. "I have the entire incident on video," he said. Another spectator lifted her phone. "So do I," she added. Within seconds, it became clear that the confrontation had been captured from multiple angles. One of the senior courthouse officers frowned slightly as he looked around the room. "All right, everyone calm down," he said firmly. "We'll review what happened." But the whispers continued. Some people were already replaying the video on their phones, showing it to the people sitting next to them. From every angle, the sequence of events looked the same. The officer had confronted Seagal. She had insulted him repeatedly. And most importantly, she had struck him first. Then she had grabbed his arm. Only after that had Seagal responded. And even then, his reaction had been controlled and minimal, just enough to break the grip and regain his space. One security guard quietly spoke to another. "Looks like clear self-defense," he murmured. Across the room, the officer slowly stood with assistants. Her expression had changed dramatically. The confidence and aggression she had shown earlier were gone. Now she looked embarrassed, confused, and increasingly aware that the situation had completely turned against her. The guard who had first addressed Seagal stepped closer again. "Sir," he said respectfully, "can you briefly explain what happened from your perspective?" Seagal nodded. "She grabbed my arm," he said calmly. "I asked her to let go." He paused for a moment before continuing. "When she refused, I redirected her movement so she couldn't hold me anymore." His explanation was simple, direct, and completely consistent with what the videos were already showing. One of the reporters nearby whispered to another journalist, "That's textbook martial arts control." The other reporter nodded. "And he barely used any force." Meanwhile, someone in the back row was already uploading a clip online. Within minutes, the footage began spreading across social media platforms. People outside the courthouse had no idea what had just happened inside, but that was about to change. Back inside the courtroom, the senior officer sighed and rubbed his forehead. "This situation could have been avoided," he said quietly. Seagal didn't argue. "I agree," he replied. The officer who had fallen avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. Her earlier words echoed uncomfortably in the minds of many spectators. Several witnesses were now being asked to provide brief statements. Reporters continued documenting everything. What had started as a routine court appearance had now become a dramatic and highly public incident. And with cameras, phones, and witnesses everywhere, there was no way to hide what had happened. The truth was already spreading. And the story was only just beginning. Now I'm curious about your opinion. Do you think Seagal handled the situation correctly by staying calm and only defending himself when necessary? Comment yes if you think he showed discipline, or no if you believe he should have walked away instead. By the time the courtroom was finally cleared and order had been restored, word about the incident had already begun spreading far beyond the courthouse walls. What had started as a tense confrontation inside a quiet courtroom was quickly turning into a story that people across the country, and even around the world, were beginning to hear about. Within hours, short video clips recorded by spectators started appearing online. Several witnesses had captured the entire moment on their phones, from the heated argument to the instant when the officer struck first, and finally the swift defensive movement that sent her off balance. In every clip, one detail stood out clearly. Steven Seagal had remained calm throughout the entire situation. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't threatened anyone. And after the officer fell, he had stepped back immediately instead of escalating the conflict. That calm reaction quickly became the focus of public discussion. News outlets began picking up the story later that afternoon. Reporters described the event as an unexpected confrontation that demonstrated the importance of self-control and discipline under pressure. Legal analysts who watched the video pointed out something important. From the footage, it appeared that Seagal had acted purely in self-defense. The officer had initiated physical contact first by slapping him and grabbing his arm. His response, they explained, looked like a controlled martial arts technique designed to break a hold rather than cause harm. For many viewers, that distinction mattered. Online comment sections filled with opinions almost instantly. Some people expressed shock that the confrontation had happened inside a courtroom. Others focused on Seagal's restraint. Thousands of viewers commented that the moment showed exactly what martial arts training was supposed to represent: control rather than aggression. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, the situation was being reviewed carefully. Witness statements were collected, and the recorded videos were examined as part of an internal review. Officials wanted to understand exactly how the confrontation had escalated so quickly. But one thing was already certain. Dozens of people had witnessed the entire exchange. And the videos left very little room for doubt about how the incident began. Later that evening, reporters approached Seagal outside the courthouse. Despite the growing media attention, he remained calm and respectful. When asked about the confrontation, he didn't insult the officer or attempt to embarrass her. Instead, he spoke about discipline. Martial arts isn't about hurting people, he explained. It's about learning how to control yourself when things get difficult. The statement was simple, but it resonated with many people who watched the interview later that night. For decades, Seagal had been known on screen as a character who could defeat enemies with ease. But in this moment, What impressed many viewers wasn't his speed or skill. It was his restraint. He had shown that real strength didn't come from anger. It came from control. The story continued circulating online for days. Clips from the courtroom appeared on news channels and discussion programs, with experts analyzing the technique he had used and the calm way he handled the confrontation. Some people praised his patience. Others debated whether the situation should have been prevented entirely. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. The moment had been a powerful reminder that discipline and composure could completely change the outcome of a tense situation. And for the spectators who had been inside that courtroom that day, it was an experience they would likely never forget. They hadn't just witnessed an argument. They had seen a real-life demonstration of something many martial artists spend years trying to master. The ability to remain calm when provoked. The ability to defend yourself without losing control. And the ability to walk away from conflict with dignity. If you believe discipline and self-control are the true signs of strength, comment respect below. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one.